Senator Lieberman, we've been allies for at least 50 years, and I've been a constituent of yours for at least 30. As young Americans back in the 1960s, you and I were part of the great civil rights movement led by the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. You and I may both have been in this picture somewhere. But you went further than I did. You traveled to Mississippi, as did Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner. Like you, they were liberal Jewish boys from well-to-do homes here in the Northeast. And like you, they were probably inspired in great part by the same scriptures that inspired you and me. You were part of a great tradition in America in those days, the liberal tradition, which inspired George Washington and Thomas Jefferson at the creation of the United States of America, a tradition carried forward in their days by the great Republican presidents Abe Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. That same tradition made great progress when the liberal mantle was passed on to the Democratic Party under Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their outstanding successors. In his first re-election campaign, FDR said a great deal that is as relevant today as it was then, including the following, which he proclaimed on October 31st in 1936. We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. As hated as President Obama is now by today's rednecks, if he doesn't challenge the entrenched, selfish business interests of our time as much as FDR did then, they may not end up hating our first black president nearly as much as they did Roosevelt. We have yet to see if Obama will be able to boast as FDR did. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master. Senator Lieberman, the Republicans and many of their big business allies just adore you nowadays, don't they? But deep in your heart, you know that the only reason they like you is that you have demonstrated a willingness to use the power that hundreds of thousands of Democrats have given you to now spit in their faces. It wasn't the Republican Party that made you a Connecticut state senator during most of the 1970s. It wasn't the Republican Party that made you the Attorney General of Connecticut during most of the 1980s. It wasn't the Republican Party that made you a U.S. Senator for the past 18 years. It wasn't the Republican Party that almost made you the first Jewish Vice President of the United States of America. Where would you be today were it not for all the time, money, and effort devoted to your career by the Democratic Party and its members? I know that it wasn't you who kissed George W. Bush, but he who kissed you. Yet you've been giving the Republican Party plenty of reason for them to love you, haven't you? Senator Lieberman, do you remember this?
The Republicans didn't like your keeping your Senate seat back in 2000 as you were running to become Vice President of the United States. They wanted to replace you with their own Philip Giordano, the mayor of one of Connecticut's larger cities, Waterbury. Had he won, Connecticut would have been represented by a man whom the FBI was investigating for political corruption, but whom in the process they found had been sexually molesting, the preteen daughter and niece of his regular prostitute. Senator, is this really the party that you want to choose in preference to the Democratic Party?
All this video is meant to be is an introduction to 2 other videos that I created to remind public servants like yourself, who pride themselves in being people of faith, what the Bible teaches regarding concern for the needy among us. The first video is comprised entirely of the teaching of the Torah on this matter, that is, the first 5 books of the Bible. So please pause the video at this point to take note of the link and follow it up. The second video is comprised entirely of the teaching of the great Hebrew prophets on the need for us to care for the neediest among us. Over our history, those who took this teaching seriously have focused the country's attention on different groups at different times. At this particular time in our history, many of us who are inspired by the teaching of those great prophets are trying to apply their teaching to assuring that all Americans have access to good and affordable health care. In the words of the great prophet Isaiah, "Woe to unjust judges and legislators, says the Lord, so that there is no justice for the poor, the fatherless, and orphans." Might we add today, or for those with no health care protection. Learn to do good, to be fair, and to help the poor, the fatherless, and widows, and those with no health care protection. Senator Lieberman, how can you think for a moment about leaving the company of liberal Democrats who have been following the teaching of Moses and the other great prophets of the Bible for decades in order to join the conservative Republicans who are following a very different Hebrew prophet named Ayn Rand, an atheist who teaches that our Bible is all wrong and that generosity and unselfishness are vices, not virtues? Joe, it's so sad that you weren't among those who returned to the mall in January of 2009 to celebrate the realization of Martin Luther King's dream. Joe and Hadassah, come back. Come back home to the company of people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who even after her husband was no longer president, was voted the most admired woman in the world for 11 years running. It's not too late for you to return to the company of great Democratic public servants like Jack, Bobby, and Teddy Kennedy, who accomplished so much for so many people that this is the way they were treated in death. If you continue on your current trajectory, who, outside of your immediate family and close friends, will even attend your funeral? How many insurance executives do you expect will skip a round of golf to do so? To the extent that permissions are required for any of the graphics that I've used, those permissions are hereby requested. Thank you.